Hey guys, Will from Boosted Media here. So Mozza Racing have asked us to put together a range of settings videos for a bunch of different sim titles. Today we're going to be looking at Assetto Corsa specifically. We've got some other videos that you'll find on this channel as well for various other sim titles. We're going to be covering the fundamental settings which I recommend for Assetto Corsa today for the Mozza R9 wheelbase. We'll also be covering some basic adjustments that you can make to these settings if you happen to own an R5, an R9 as we see here, of course, an R16 or an R21 wheelbase. So this video should have you covered for pretty much everything from the Mozza ecosystem for Assetto Corsa. So we're going to jump into the Mozza pit house settings first, and then we'll take you through some of the settings in Assetto Corsa as well. So starting off on the home tab here, we're going to set our maximum steering angle adjustment to 900 degrees. Now, if you're driving a Formula style car, you may want to reduce this, but AC does a pretty good job of dynamically adjusting this anyway. So I find, generally speaking, 900 can just sort of be a set and forget value for Assetto Corsa. If you are having problems though, fiddle around with this. What this basically is just doing is interpreting the angle of the steering wheel physically and then relaying that information into the game. So obviously you want to make sure that your wheel is pretty close to one-to-one rotation. Unless you're driving on a track like Monaco in an F1 car, for example, you might want to have a slightly tighter rotation just to get around some of those hairpin turns. Now over in game force feedback intensity, I generally will recommend running this at 100% strength. That's just to make full use of the entire dynamic range provided by the telemetry coming out of the game. So we're going to leave that set to 100%. If you are running a R16 or R21, you may want to reduce this slightly, but then the argument is that why are you paying all that extra money for a more powerful base if you're not going to make use of the full dynamic range available mechanically in the base? So recommending 100% setting there. Play around with it if you're finding that it's a little bit too strong. And there is another setting that we'll look at a little bit later on, which caps the maximum amount of torque output without reducing the dynamic range below that threshold point. So we'll explain that when we get to it as well. So jump down to the wheelbase tab now. We're going to go through the various different tabs here. Now, if you've recently updated your firmware, and I would recommend you do that before you apply these settings, there are other videos available on YouTube showing you exactly how to do that. You may notice that the tabs have slightly changed from some of the older versions. So a few settings are now moved to miscellaneous. So we'll start there. Now, the soft limit stiffness is basically just a software-based mechanical bump stop that you feel when you get to the end of the rotation angle. So at the moment on the soft setting, it feels pretty authentic, feels kind of like a bump stop in a real car. If you increase that value to say hard, for example, then when you get to the end, it feels quite robotic and quite clunky. I just personally find it feels a little bit more authentic in the softer setting, but you do have 10 points of adjustment here. You can fine tune that to your personal preference. It doesn't really have an impact on the driving experience, but it is an adjustment that is there should you wish to use it. Soft limit game force strength, that's just switching this feature on or off. And temperature control strategy, look, honestly, we've never had any issues with temperature on any of the Mozza bases that we've tested here. So I recommend just generally leaving that on the conservative setting as you see here. Now we're going to jump back to basic settings now. We do have a bunch of presets here for various different types of cars. Obviously, Assetto Corsa has a massive variety of different types of cars, from Formula style all the way through to drifting. So there are a couple of baseline profiles here which they include. We're going to give you a basic set of settings here which you can fine tune to the types of different cars that you're driving. We'll explain what each setting does and how it influences the driving experience as well. So maximum steering angle, same adjustment as we looked at just before. Within this tab though, we do have the ability to set it to asynchronous mode. What that does is it decouples the rotation angle as it's interpreted from the game separately to the software-based mechanical bump stop that we saw later on. So what that allows you to do is, for example, have your rotation set a little bit more sensitive, but then not have that mechanical bump stop bump in until a little bit further through the rotation, so you're not constantly hitting it. I generally just leave this set to synchronous, never really found that to be an issue, but it is cool that they give you the ability to adjust those independently. Road sensitivity, that is the strength and sensation of things like road texture, bumps, cracks in the road, all those kinds of details. For Assetto Corsa, you're probably going to want to be somewhere between about 8 and 10, depending again on the type of car you're driving. If you're driving a Formula style car or something with really, really super stiff suspension, you may find you want to reduce this a little bit just to get a slightly less robotic feeling. But in most cases, I find I end up leaving that set to 10. So game force feedback intensity, this is like an attenuator that sits on top of the signal that's coming out of the game and being interpreted by the driver software. So again, for the R5, the R9, I would generally recommend leaving this set to 100. If you've got an R16 or an R21, you may want to reduce it a little bit. The argument against that would be, well, if you've spent the extra money for a more powerful base, why wouldn't you want to make full use of the full dynamic range? So I generally would recommend leaving this set to 100% unless you're just finding that it's just completely overpowering, again, for the type of car that you're driving. So again, Formula style car, you may want to crank this down a little bit. If you're driving a street car, you're probably going to end up cranking that all the way up to 100. Now, maximum wheel speed, this is the reaction speed or rotation speed of the wheel, how quickly it reacts to what's going on inside the sim. So for drifting, you're probably going to crank this all the way up to the maximum. For street style cars, you're going to be more down towards the other side. For general sort of Formula and GT style race cars, you're probably going to be somewhere around about the middle. A little bit higher up, I found was good than some of the other sims that we've been looking at in this video series. So 120% would be my recommendation as a starting point, and then fine tune from there depending on what you're driving. Wheel spring strength, we're going to leave this set to 0. This is purely a stand-in for older racing titles which maybe don't have any force feedback and don't have the ability to tell the wheel to return to center. So if the wheel's just kind of free playing in the game that you happen to be playing, obviously not Assetto Corsa, then you may need to use this. But for AC, we're going to leave this set to 0. It basically does nothing because that data comes through from the sim. Wheel damper, this is an adjustment that sort of makes the wheel feel mechanically connected to something inside the car. Now on AC, I do tend to run this a little bit higher just because the force feedback can feel a little bit robotic in some cars. Again, it's going to greatly depend on the car that you're driving. 60% is generally a pretty good starting point here. The higher you go with this, the more numb the steering is going to feel. The lower you go, the sharper it's going to feel, but it will start to become a little bit robotic in feeling the lower you go there. So it's always going to be a bit of a balance, and something I would definitely recommend spend some time playing around with. So that is everything in the basic tab. We're going to move across to advanced settings now. Maximum output torque limit. Now this works a little bit differently from capping the signal. What this does is it actually hard limits the amount of torque that the base is able to output. Now again, you probably aren't going to be using this for an R5 or an R9. If you're on an R16 or an R21, you may want to limit the torque in some scenario. So maybe you're racing in a kind of door-to-door racing series where you're doing a lot of bumping into other cars. Maybe you're just wanting to go crazy in AI against traffic or something like that, and you're finding that the wheel's just getting reefed out of your hands when you're making contact. You may want to limit the torque output. That would be one potential scenario where it may be useful. If you've got young kids that are using a rig occasionally, I would definitely recommend cranking this down just to make sure it's limited to safe levels. These wheelbases, even the R5, is strong enough to injure a child, so you definitely want to be taking that seriously. For most people though, I can't see too many cases where you would want to limit the output torque. Obviously you want to make use of all of the torque that's available on the base that you've purchased. So I'm going to recommend leaving that set to 100 for most cases. Steering wheel inertia, this is like a counterbalance for the particular wheel that you happen to have mounted on the rig. So different wheels obviously have different weights, and this is allowing for the different amounts of inertia inherent in the wheel that you might have connected. So for the FSR wheel that we have here, we can click on the preset. I actually prefer to run it a little bit higher, up around the sort of 2000 mark, but that's the default setting that they have there. And then we move into natural inertia and wheel friction. Now these kind of work hand in hand with the dampening setting to allow for some more characteristics that you would feel in the steering rack of a real race car and not just an electric motor sitting on a sim rig. So natural inertia gives you the sensation of the wheel sort of trying to continue its movement in whatever direction you're moving it. So you can imagine when you've got energy going into a steering rack inside a car, you've got the tires moving across the surface. It doesn't just stop moving immediately the second you stop moving your hand. You feel that hesitation, you feel that resistance in the wheel kind of trying to want to continue to move in that direction. And that is what this is simulating here. So again, depending on the type of car you're driving will vary what this is set to. 150% feels pretty good for me inside AC for the majority of cars. Wheel friction kind of along the same kind of lines, but rather than it continuing the movement, it's just kind of adding the sensation of weight in the steering as you're moving. And again, it will depend on the type of car. Some cars have naturally heavier steering than others, and that is included in the telemetry data coming out that's actually generating the force feedback. But for me, around 20% feels pretty good for the majority of cars. Now, speed dependent dampening, this is purely just adjusting the dampening depending on how fast the vehicle's going. I found 20% with a threshold of 90 kilometers an hour feels good for pretty much every single sim title. Obviously, you're not going to be spending much time below 90 kilometers an hour anyway, so it's not going to have a massive impact on driving. So then we move across to the force feedback equalizer. Now this allows us to adjust the gain or strength at various different frequency points throughout the dynamic range. So we don't have any Q adjustment. We can't adjust the width of the frequency range that we're adjusting, but you can see here as we go up and down, it's making an adjustment. And we've got little labels here as well that tell us roughly what it's going to be influencing. So I found for AC, 130% for body bumps and curb effects feels pretty good. As we get up to around 15 Hertz, bumping it up to 140%. AVS vibration and curb effects effects, we were sitting at around sort of 150% mark. Grass effects, we were sitting at 160%, and then sand effects, we boosted up that little bit more to 170. So basically, the more granular the detail, the more high frequency the detail, the more we're going to want to boost that signal just to get that detail to come through the wheelbase. And that is pretty much everything in terms of the Pithouse software. So let's jump in now to the Assetto Corsa settings and see what we need to adjust in there. Now I'm using Content Manager here. I would recommend everybody use Content Manager for AC. It's just an absolutely brilliant piece of software. The settings are the same as what you're going to see in here for force feedback settings though. So if you're confused as to what you're looking at, that is the reason why. But we're going to go to the settings tab in Content Manager. There's a bunch of videos on YouTube about Content Manager, so if you want to know what it is, how to install it, and what exactly it does, so you can definitely check those out. So settings tab, then we're going to go to the control tab and the force feedback tab. Pretty simple, straightforward setup here, guys. We're going to set the gain to somewhere between about 60 and 90% depending on your preference. I prefer to run it a little bit higher because at the moment I'm mostly driving Formula style cars in AC. If you're driving more street cars, you probably will find you want to go more down towards the sort of 60% mark. It's just going to be purely down to the types of cars that you're driving here. With the 90% gain adjustment here in the settings that we're running in Pithouse, with the more street style cars, it does tend to feel a little bit too robotic, so just crank that down accordingly. Our filter and minimum force are both going to remain on 0. Curb effect, road effect, slip effect, and ABS. I'm running 15, 15, 10%, and 0%. Very much a subjective thing here. You may actually prefer to just run all of these on 0. I like to boost the curb, road, and slip effect just that tiny little bit, just to give a little bit more definition in the force feedback. But I would definitely recommend experiment with these settings, use this as a baseline, and fine tune from there. Then over in post-processing, these are just left at their default settings. So center boost gain 0%, center boost range 10%, low speed force feedback reduction, that's purely just to reduce the force feedback when you're stationary. Well, that's the way I've got it set up anyway. So anywhere under 3 kilometers an hour, it's going to feel that little bit weaker. Remember again, of course, we do have that additional speed-based dampening that we looked at earlier in Pithouse. And that is everything you need to know in terms of Assetto Corsa settings. So leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Let us know in the comments as well whether these are similar to the settings you run, or if you found some really awesome settings, let us know what they are and what cars you're using them for down below. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you again next time. Bye.